Welcome to this episode of the Explainer video series. My name is Johannes Honneth and I'm an analyst at the TPI Centre. In this video, we will cover the area that assesses 2030 and the upcoming 2035 targets. The ASCOR framework is built on three pillars that assess a different aspect of country climate performance. Each pillar covers relevant areas in line with its theme. In this area, we are located in the first pillar, called emissions pathways. We also assess in this pillar historical emissions in EP1 and net zero targets in EP3. If you're interested in further information on any of these areas, please take a look at the ASCOR Framework Methodology note from the link below the table. My presentation today is threefold. I will give you a short intro to 2030 targets and the reasoning why we assess this in the ASCOR framework. I will then logically turn to the question of how we assess 2030 targets, and then lastly speak about what the results of the 2024 assessment cycle look like. And I will also touch base here on some what seems to be good emerging practices. I should say that we also start to assess 2035 targets, but this presentation will only focus on 2030 targets. Let's start with a quick introduction. Emission reduction targets are one of the central aspects of international climate policies as they are directly implemented in the Paris Agreement. To be specific, Article 4 requests parties to prepare, communicate, and maintain successive national determined contributions that it intends to achieve. Such NDCs include emissions targets for 2030 and starting when 2025 updates also for 2035 that are in the best case economy-wide, so covers all sectors and also cover all greenhouse gases. It is important that in general such targets could be set arbitrarily, which is why it is important to assess how these position themselves with respect to the Paris Agreement and the temperature goal of 1.5 degrees. The alignment of these targets is important so that the transition to a low carbon world can happen in a credible and orderly way. Medium-term ambition as 2030 targets help here by setting a strategic direction for climate action. International climate finance and the usage of market mechanisms under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement can support countries to reach their target. To assess targets independently, so unconditional on finance and on the reliance on carbon credits, sheds light on intended direct and independent actions taken by national governments to decarbonize domestic emissions. When one wants to check the alignment of these targets with the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, one needs to somehow distribute the global allowance to emit greenhouse gas emissions. Resulting Paris Agreement aligned pathways can be derived in two ways. One can distribute allocations following cost-effective thinking that is influenced by the question which countries face the lowest or highest cost to decarbonize, or by including so-called equity principles and the principle of common but differential responsibilities. Here, one calculates weight on, e.g., financial capabilities to allocate such emissions. Spoiler, we use both ways to assess the alignment 2030 targets to give you the complete picture. More on this in the next part, where I will talk about how we implement all these factors in the framework and in the respective area of 2030 targets. We assess the area of 2030 targets with the help of four indicators. First of all, we assess if the country at all has committed to a 2030 target and what the reduction is compared to 2019 levels. Next to this, we assess if the country is transparent on the intended use of carbon credits, and if yes, how much of these target the country plans to meet with credits. We then turn towards the alignment indicators and assess if the country's target is aligned with its cost-effective benchmark, and also it says if it aligns with the country's fair share allowance. For both these approaches, the cost minimizing and the fair share approach, we provide the user with the degree of alignment of the target. Most often, this is unfortunately a degree of misalignment, indicated then by a positive percentage difference. Summarizing these 4 indicators, this area assesses the existence of unconditional targets, their reliance on carbon credits, and their alignment with 1.5 degrees. Using the historic responsibility, financial capability, and population of countries to calculate fair share allowances for each of these countries implements the principle of common but differential responsibilities. One should also note that we focus on national commitments that represent ambition at the sovereign level, and that we look at NDCs communicated to the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, UNFCCC, but also at other official legislative and executive documents. I will spare you the sources for our quantitative alignment assessment, but I still want to show you how such a country pathway and respective alignment with 1.5 degrees looks in general. Well, let's say country XY has quite stable emissions since 2005, which is marked in blue, so relatively stable historical emissions. This country now has committed to a target that amounts to targeting a reduction of roughly a third of its emissions in 2030, indicated by the blue dotted line. Independent from this, we calculate the cost-effective 1.5 degree benchmark for 2030, indicated with gray, and also the fair share allowance for 2030, indicated by the light green color. You can easily see that the country is not aligned with 1.5 degrees in both cases. The degree of misalignment is indicated by this orange arrow for cost-effective modeling and by this arrow for the fair share allocation. Okay, now to the interesting part of how countries actually perform within this area. Almost all countries have committed to an unconditional 2030 emission target. Over half of the NDCs lack information on how much countries plan to rely on carbon credits to meet their targets. All of the targets lack ambition. Only Costa Rica and Angola have 2030 NDC that narrowly miss their respective cost-effective benchmark by about 5 and 10% respectively. Meanwhile, 20% of the countries have targets aligned with their fair share allocation in 2030. Some further things we observed during the assessments and definitely worthwhile. So Denmark and Barbados have committed to really ambitious 2030 targets by stating that they will reduce emissions by 55 and 73% respectively in 2030. We also observe that more and more countries are transparent on the sectoral and greenhouse gas coverage of their targets, and which makes our life as analysts more easily. The same is not true for the reliance on carbon credits. Only Japan has transparently elaborated in its NDC that it plans to use carbon credits by an amount equal to 15% of its target. Of course, only looking at emission reduction targets of countries does not give you a complete overview of a country's management on climate change and its accompanying risks. Austria, Denmark, and Sweden have decreased their emissions over the past 5 years, have set 2030 targets, but also tie these targets to adequate climate policies to pave the way for further emissions reductions in the future. That wraps up our overview of 2030 targets. If you would like to learn more about ASCOR or explore other episodes of the ASCOR Explainer video series, to, for example, learn about adequate climate policies, please visit our website. Thank you for watching.